The suspenseful hook. David adjusted the controls of his compact, gravity-free apartment on the bustling intergalactic trade station known as Orbital Nexus 7. As a human diplomat stationed far from Earth, he was used to the strange and the unfamiliar. Yet nothing had prepared him for his newest challenge, his alien maid Carol. Carol belonged to the Threxian species known for their extraordinary precision and unmatched efficiency. Hiring her seemed like a practical choice for someone as busy as David. She was quiet, her 4 arms moving gracefully as she cleaned every corner of the apartment. Her tall, sleek frame and glimmering, emerald green skin were a common sight in this part of the galaxy. At first, everything seemed fine, until David started noticing peculiar things. It began subtly. One evening, after a long day of negotiations, David returned to his quarters to find his leftover pasta meticulously rearranged in the fridge. He was certain he hadn't left it that way. The next day, a protein bar he'd been saving disappeared entirely. At first, he dismissed these incidents as his own forgetfulness or minor quirks of living in a busy trade hub. But then there was the incident with the soup. David had been craving something warm and familiar, so he prepared a bowl of tomato soup. After finishing half of it, he left the bowl on the counter to answer a holo call. When he returned, the soup looked different. The surface was smoother, as though someone, or something, had licked it. He felt a chill creep up his spine. "Carl?" he called out hesitantly. She appeared almost instantly, her movements unnervingly silent. "Yes, sir," she asked in her soft, melodic voice, her large, glowing eyes fixed on him. David stared at her, unsure how to frame his suspicion. "Did you, touch my soup?" Carol tilted her head, her antennae twitching slightly. "No, sir. I would never interfere with your nourishment." Her words were polite, but there was something unsettling about the way she said them. Calm, almost too calm. David decided to let it go, but the unease lingered. That night, he couldn't sleep. He kept replaying her words in his mind. He had always been good at reading people, a skill that made him an excellent diplomat. But with Carol, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something. He resolved to pay closer attention to her behavior. Over the next few days, David became more observant. He noticed how Carol would pause whenever he ate, her glowing eyes locked onto him. It wasn't just a passing glance. It was intense, almost predatory. Her breathing seemed to change, becoming shallow and rapid, though she quickly composed herself whenever he looked her way. One evening, while David was reading a report, he heard a faint noise coming from the kitchen. He crept over quietly, his heart pounding. Peering around the corner, he saw Carol standing in front of the fridge. One of her arms was extended, holding the container of leftovers. Her other hands trembled slightly as she opened it and brought the food close to her face. "Carl." David's voice cut through the silence like a blade. She froze, her glowing eyes widening in shock. Slowly, she turned to face him, the container still in her hand. "I was organizing your provisions," she said, her voice steady but her body language tense. David stared at her, unsure of what to say. He didn't want to accuse her of stealing, but the evidence was piling up. "Just leave the food alone, okay?" Carol nodded once and returned the container to the fridge. As she left the kitchen, David noticed something strange. The air around her seemed warmer, charged with a faint electric energy. Later that night, David woke to an eerie sensation. The room was dark, but he felt someone watching him. He sat up slowly, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. Standing at the doorway was Carol. She wasn't moving, just standing there, her glowing eyes fixed on him. "Carl," he whispered, his voice barely audible. She didn't respond. After a long, tense moment, she turned and disappeared down the hallway. David's heart raced as he tried to make sense of what he'd just seen. Was she sleepwalking? Or was something else going on? The rational part of his mind told him he was overthinking. But deep down, he knew there was more to Carol than met the eye. For the first time since arriving at Orbital Nexus 7, David felt truly uneasy. What had he brought into his home? He resolved to find out, before it was too late. Growing suspicion. The morning after the unsettling encounter, David found himself replaying the events of the previous night. Carol standing in the doorway, her glowing eyes locked on him. It wasn't something he could dismiss as a coincidence or mere curiosity. There was something deeper, something he couldn't put his finger on. David decided to approach the situation methodically. After all, he was a trained diplomat. Unraveling mysteries and uncovering hidden truths was part of his job. But this time, it felt personal. Carol wasn't just an enigmatic colleague or a foreign ambassador. She was in his home, sharing his space, and now she was a potential threat. He began by quietly observing her throughout the day. Carol went about her duties as usual, her four arms moving in perfect harmony as she cleaned surfaces, rearranged items, and adjusted the environmental settings in his quarters. Yet David noticed small, telling details. Whenever he ate, her gaze lingered a little too long. It wasn't the casual glance of someone passing by. It was focused, almost analytical. She would often pause in her tasks, her antennae twitching subtly as though picking up some invisible signal in the air. And then there were the strange sounds. At night, David began hearing faint growls and clicks coming from Carol's room. They weren't loud enough to wake someone who wasn't listening for them, but David's heightened awareness made every sound feel amplified. It wasn't the kind of noise you'd expect from a Threxian, a species known for their quiet and efficient nature. He decided to test his suspicions. That evening, he left a tray of food on the kitchen counter, a mix of human snacks and nutrient packets he picked up from the station's marketplace. Then he pretended to leave the apartment, activating the sound dampener on the door to give the illusion of departure. David waited in silence, hiding just outside the kitchen with a small handheld scanner. The seconds stretched into minutes, and just when he thought he might be wrong, he heard soft footsteps. Peeking around the corner, he saw Carol standing over the tray. At first, she seemed hesitant, her hands hovering over the snacks. Then, to David's shock, she picked up a protein bar, held it close to her face, and inhaled deeply. Her glowing eyes flickered brighter for a moment, and a low guttural hum escaped her throat. What happened next sent chills down David's spine. Carol didn't eat the food. Instead, she placed her palm flat over the tray and closed her eyes. The scanner in David's hand beeped softly, indicating a sudden energy spike. He stared in disbelief as the food began to change. The protein bar shriveled slightly, its edges curling inward, as though the energy had been sucked out of it. Even the nutrient packets dimmed, their once vibrant colors fading. David felt a rush of adrenaline. He stepped forward, his voice firm. "Carol, stop." Carol spun around, her eyes wide with shock. For a moment, the glow in her eyes intensified, casting eerie shadows across her face. Then, just as quickly, it dimmed, and she looked down, her body trembling slightly. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. David didn't know what to say. He glanced at the tray, now devoid of its usual energy-rich glow. "What did you do?" he asked, his tone a mix of confusion and accusation. Carol hesitated, her antennae drooping. "It's complicated. I can't explain it in a way you'd understand." "Try me," David said, crossing his arms. "I'm not going to ignore this, Carol. You've been acting strange, and now I find you draining my food. What's going on?" Carol met his gaze, her glowing eyes filled with something David hadn't seen before. "Fear. You wouldn't believe me, even if I told you." "Try me," David repeated, his voice softer this time. Carol hesitated, then took a step back, her hands clasped together. "I promise I'll explain. Soon. But please, don't tell anyone." David wanted to press further, but he could see how shaken she was. "Fine," he said after a long pause. "But this isn't over." As Carol retreated to her room, David sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the tray of lifeless snacks. Whatever was happening with Carol, it was far from normal. And whatever she was hiding, it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. An unexpected encounter. David couldn't let the strange events with Carol fester any longer. The food drained of its energy, the unnerving glow of her eyes, and her cryptic refusal to explain. It all pointed to something beyond his understanding. As much as he wanted to confront her directly, he realized he needed more information. Answers would have to come from outside his quarters. The following morning, David made his way to the station archives, a sprawling library of data that cataloged everything from alien physiology to intergalactic laws. He began by searching for records on Threxian biology and behavior. As he scanned through the data, he found nothing unusual. No mention of energy consumption, glowing eyes, or predatory tendencies. The Threxians were renowned for their discipline, precision, and peaceful nature. Whatever Carol was experiencing, it wasn't common to her species. Frustrated, David leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "What am I missing?" he muttered to himself. "Perhaps I can help," a voice said, startling him. David turned to see a tall, broad-shouldered alien in an official uniform standing nearby. The newcomer had shimmering silver skin and piercing blue eyes that seemed to radiate authority. David recognized the insignia on the uniform: Galactic Inspector, a role tasked with maintaining order across the trade hub. "I'm Inspector Relkor," the alien introduced himself, his voice calm but commanding. "I couldn't help but notice your search queries. You're looking into Threxian anomalies." David hesitated, unsure whether to trust this stranger, but something about Relkor's presence felt reassuring. "Yes," he admitted. "I've noticed some strange behavior from someone I work with. I thought the archives might have answers, but so far, nothing." Relkor nodded, his expression serious. "You won't find much in the public archives, but if it's unusual behavior you're concerned about, there's something you should know." The inspector gestured for David to follow him to a private room. Once inside, Relkor activated a holo display and pulled up a classified report. The image on the screen showed a disturbing scene: an alien with glowing eyes and a feral expression, surrounded by devastated remains of a dining hall. "This is from an incident on a neighboring station," Relkor explained. "A Threxian maid exhibited similar symptoms to what you've described: glowing eyes, erratic behavior, an apparent hunger for energy. She attacked her employer, leaving him in critical condition." David felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. What caused it? Relkor sighed. "A mutation. Some species, when exposed to prolonged contact with humans, experience a rare genetic shift. The mutation amplifies their biological instincts and creates a craving, not for food, but for the unique energy humans emit when they're alive and emotional." David's mind raced. "Are you saying Carel could be infected?" "It's possible," Relkor said gravely. "The condition is rare but dangerous. Those affected often lose control over time. If your maid is showing early signs, you're in serious danger." The weight of the situation pressed down on David. He thought back to Carol's behavior: the lingering stares, the drained food, the unsettling way she watched him at night. Could she be fighting this hunger, or was she moments away from losing control? "What do I do?" David asked, his voice tense. Relkor's expression hardened. "You need to report her immediately. The authorities can detain and quarantine her. It's the only way to ensure your safety." David hesitated. As strange and frightening as Carol's behavior had been, she'd never actually hurt him. She seemed aware of her condition, even ashamed of it. Turning her in felt wrong. "There has to be another way," David said. "Some kind of treatment, or—" "There isn't," Relkor interrupted firmly. "The mutation is irreversible. If you don't act now, it could cost you your life." David thanked Relkor for the information but left the room feeling conflicted. As he walked back to his quarters, his mind replayed Carl's whispered apology, the fear in her eyes when he confronted her. She wasn't a monster. At least, not yet. Could he really betray her trust and hand her over to the authorities? Or was there another way to help her without risking his own safety? When he entered his apartment, Carell was standing by the window, gazing out at the endless expanse of stars. She turned as he approached, her glowing eyes soft and weary. "You've been gone a while," she said quietly. David nodded, his throat dry. "I needed answers." Carell's antennae twitched, and she looked away. "And did you find them?" David didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied her, searching for any sign of malice or deception. All he saw was exhaustion, like she'd been fighting a battle no one else could see. "I did," he said finally. "But I need you to tell me the truth, Carell. What's happening to you?" She hesitated, her hands clasped tightly. "You don't understand what it's like," she said softly. "The hunger. It's constant. I've tried to control it, but it's getting harder." "Why didn't you tell me?" David asked, his voice a mix of frustration and concern. "Because I didn't want you to be afraid of me," she admitted, tears glistening in her glowing eyes. "You've been kind to me, David. I didn't want to ruin that." David felt a surge of empathy, but it was quickly tempered by the memory of Relker's warning. Time was running out, for both of them. Carell's true hunger. David couldn't sleep that night. Carell's admission replayed in his mind, her trembling voice and glowing eyes a haunting reminder of the danger he was now living with. She wasn't just his mate anymore. She was a ticking time bomb, fighting an urge she might not be able to control. But David wasn't the kind of man to abandon someone in need. He had seen enough of intergalactic politics to know that trust and empathy could achieve what fear and suspicion never could. If Carell was trying to resist her instincts, then perhaps there was still hope. The next morning, David decided to test just how far Carell's condition had progressed. He carefully set up a hidden camera in the kitchen and left a tray of food on the counter. The tray contained a mix of Earth snacks and nutrient-rich alien energy packs, enough to tempt anyone. Then he told Carell he had a meeting at the station's administrative hub and left, deliberately leaving the food unattended. Hiding in the shadows outside his apartment, David watched the live feed from the hidden camera on his datavat. At first, nothing happened. Carell went about her duties as usual, her graceful movements as efficient and controlled as always. But when she noticed the tray of food, her entire demeanor changed. Carell paused, her antennae twitching. Slowly, she approached the counter, her glowing eyes fixed on the tray. Her breathing grew heavier, her chest rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths. David watched as she extended one of her hands toward the food, hesitating for a moment before picking up a protein bar. What happened next left him stunned. Carell didn't eat the bar. Instead, she placed it in the palm of her hand and closed her eyes. Her glow intensified, bathing the kitchen in an eerie green light. A soft hum filled the room as the protein bar began to change, its surface shriveled and darkened, as though its very essence was being drained. Within seconds, it looked like nothing more than a lifeless husk. Carell's body trembled as she absorbed the energy, her glow pulsating rhythmically. David's heart pounded. This wasn't just hunger, it was something primal, almost predatory. He clenched his fists, torn between fear and a strange sense of pity. Whatever Carell was going through, it wasn't something she had chosen. Suddenly, Carell's head snapped up, her glowing eyes locking onto the camera. David's breath caught in his throat. Had she sensed him watching? For a long moment, she stood there, staring directly into the lens. Then, with deliberate slowness, she set the protein bar down and left the kitchen. David knew he couldn't avoid the confrontation any longer. Gathering his courage, he re-entered the apartment and found Carell sitting on the floor of the living room, her arms wrapped around her knees. She looked up as he approached, her expression a mix of guilt and exhaustion. "You were watching me," she said softly, her voice devoid of accusation. David nodded, setting his datapad on the table. "I had to know the truth, Carell, and now I do." Carell lowered her gaze. "I'm sorry. I tried to resist, but the hunger, It's unbearable. What is it, exactly? David asked, his tone gentler now. What are you experiencing? Carol hesitated, her antennae drooping. It's a mutation, she said finally. Our scientists don't fully understand it. When my kind are exposed to humans for prolonged periods, something changes inside us. Your energy, it's unlike anything else in the galaxy. It's intoxicating. David frowned, leaning forward. You mean our food? Or, not just your food, Carl interrupted, her voice trembling. It's you. Your emotions, your vitality, your very presence. It radiates a kind of energy that we can't help but crave. At first, it's subtle, but the more time we spend around you, the stronger the hunger becomes. David's stomach churned. And what happens if you don't satisfy it? Carol looked away, her glowing eyes dimming. I don't know. I've been trying to suppress it, to survive on the energy from your food instead. But it's not enough. Each day, the hunger grows stronger. I don't want to hurt you, David, but I'm afraid I might. Her words sent a chill through him. Carol wasn't just fighting her instincts. She was fighting a battle she knew she was losing. David took a deep breath, trying to process everything. Why didn't you tell me sooner? He asked. Because I was afraid, Carl admitted. Afraid you'd see me as a monster. That you'd send me away, or worse. David's mind raced. Relker's warning echoed in his thoughts, but so did Carl's plea. She wasn't a monster, not yet. If she was willing to fight her instincts, then maybe there was a way to help her. But how much risk was he willing to take? I'm not going to abandon you, Carl, he said finally. But we need to figure this out, together. If there's a way to control this hunger, we'll find it. Carol looked up, her glowing eyes filled with a fragile hope. You would do that, even after everything. David nodded. You're not just my maid, Carol. You're my friend, and I'm not going to give up on you. For the first time since the ordeal began, Carol smiled, a small, fleeting expression that carried both gratitude and fear. But as the glow in her eyes flickered brighter, David couldn't shake the feeling that their battle was far from over. The revelation, the fragile truce between David and Carol didn't last long. Despite his assurances, David couldn't shake the unease growing inside him. Carl's hunger wasn't just dangerous. It was an unpredictable force, and every moment she spent fighting it seemed to chip away at her resolve. He needed answers, and he needed them now. Determined, David contacted Inspector Relker once again. Meeting in a secluded area of the station, David laid everything out. Carl's glowing eyes, the energy she drained from food, and her admission of craving human vitality. Relker listened carefully, his silver-skinned face unreadable. When David finished, the inspector let out a long sigh. You're lucky to be alive, he said bluntly. Most humans in your position wouldn't have made it this far. David bristled at the comment. She hasn't hurt me. She's trying to fight this. Isn't there something we can do to help her? Relker shook his head. You don't understand, David. This mutation, it's not just a craving. It's a transformation. The longer she suppresses it, the more violent the hunger becomes. Eventually, it will overwhelm her. And when that happens, he trailed off, his meaning clear. David clenched his fists. So you're saying there's no hope? That she's doomed no matter what? The inspector hesitated, then tapped a command into his holo display. A series of files appeared, filled with reports and classified data. There's one possibility, Relker said, but it's dangerous. For both of you. David leaned forward, his heart pounding. Tell me. Relker's voice grew serious. There's a theory, untested, unproven, that the hunger can be satisfied through controlled energy exposure. If you were to voluntarily emit high levels of emotional energy, it might temporarily suppress her cravings. But it's risky. Too much exposure could drain you completely, leaving you weak or even comatose. David swallowed hard, the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. And if we don't try this? Relker met his gaze. Then she'll lose control, and you won't survive the aftermath. The choice was clear, but it wasn't an easy one. David thanked Relker and returned to his quarters, his mind racing. When he entered, he found Carol sitting cross-legged on the floor, her eyes closed and her breathing shallow. Her glow was dimmer than before, her body visibly weaker. "Carol," he said softly, kneeling beside her. She opened her eyes, and for a moment, he saw a flicker of fear and hope. "You're back." "I spoke to someone who might have a solution," David said. "But it's not without risks, for either of us." Carol's antennae twitched. "What kind of risks?" David explained Relker's theory, watching her expression shift from surprise to horror. "No," she said firmly, shaking her head. "I won't let you do that. It's too dangerous." "I don't have a choice," David replied. "If we don't try this, you'll lose control. And I won't let that happen. Not to you." Carol's glowing eyes filled with tears. "David, you don't understand what you're offering. It's not just energy. It's everything that makes you human. Your emotions, your strength, it's what keeps you alive. If I take too much, you won't," David interrupted, his voice steady. "I trust you, Carol. I know you can control this. And if this is the only way to help you, then I'll take the risk." Carol looked away, her body trembling. "I don't deserve this. After everything I've done, everything I've hidden from you, I don't deserve your kindness." "You deserve a chance," David said firmly. "And I'm going to give it to you." With Carol's reluctant agreement, they prepared for the experiment. David rigged a small energy amplifier, a piece of advanced tech he'd borrowed from the station's lab. The device would enhance the natural energy he emitted, making it easier for Carol to absorb without completely draining him. At least that was the theory. They sat facing each other in the dimly lit living room, the amplifier humming softly between them. Carol's glowing eyes flickered nervously as she extended her hands. "Are you sure about this?" she asked one last time. David nodded. "Do it." Carol closed her eyes, her hands hovering inches from his chest. The glow around her intensified, filling the room with an eerie green light. David felt a strange warmth spreading through his body, followed by a tingling sensation. It wasn't painful, but it was unsettling, like something deep inside him was being pulled away. As the process continued, Carol's glow grew brighter, her trembling subsiding. David, on the other hand, began to feel weaker. His breathing became shallow, and his vision blurred at the edges. "Carol," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "That's enough." Carol's eyes snapped open, and she immediately pulled back, her glow dimming. "David," she cried, catching him as he slumped forward. "I'm okay," he murmured, though his body felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. "Did it work?" Carol stared at him, her glowing eyes filled with a mixture of relief and guilt. "Yes," she said softly. "The hunger. It's gone. For now." David managed a weak smile. Then it was worth it. As Carol helped him to the couch, she couldn't stop the tears streaming down her face. "I won't let this happen again," she vowed. "I'll find a way to control this. I promise." David nodded, his exhaustion overwhelming him. "We'll figure it out. Together." As he drifted into unconsciousness, Carol sat beside him, her determination stronger than ever. But deep down, she knew their battle was far from over. And the next time, the stakes would be even higher. A dangerous plan. David awoke to the faint hum of the station's artificial gravity systems, his body heavy and his mind foggy. Carol sat nearby, her tall frame silhouetted against the dim light of the living room. Her glowing eyes, though dimmer now, still held an intensity that made his chest tighten. He could see the guilt etched into her every movement, but there was also something new, a steely resolve. "How are you feeling?" Carol asked, her voice soft, but filled with concern. David managed a weak smile. "Like I've been hit by a starship, but I'll live." Carol looked away, her antennae drooping. "I shouldn't have let you do it. You nearly." "Stop," David interrupted, his voice firm despite his exhaustion. "It worked, didn't it? That's all that matters." Carol didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stood and began pacing the room, her forearms clasped tightly. "It's not a solution, David. It's a delay. The hunger will return, and when it does—" She stopped, her glowing eyes locking onto his. "We can't keep doing this. It's too dangerous for you." David sat up slowly, ignoring the protest from his aching muscles. "Then we need a better plan." Carol hesitated, then nodded. "There's something I haven't told you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something I was afraid to admit." David frowned. "What is it?" Carol took a deep breath, her glowing eyes flickering. "There's a facility, an old Threxian research station, on the edge of this sector. It was abandoned years ago, but it's where the first cases of this mutation were studied. If there are answers anywhere, they'll be there." David's heart raced. "Why didn't you mention this before?" "Because it's dangerous," Carol said, her voice trembling. "The station was shut down for a reason. The experiments there, they weren't just about understanding the mutation. They were trying to weaponize it. If we go there, we'll be walking into a place full of traps, failed experiments, and who knows what else." David leaned forward, his determination hardening. "Then we'll be careful. But we have to try, Carol. If there's even a chance of finding a cure, it's worth the risk." Carol stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll guide you there, but promise me, if it becomes too dangerous, we'll leave. No matter what." "Deal," David said, standing despite his unsteady legs. "When do we leave?" The journey to the research station was tense. David piloted a small shuttle borrowed from the station's hangar, while Carol provided coordinates. As they neared their destination, the station came into view, a dark, hulking structure drifting on the edge of a barren asteroid field. Its once bright lights were now dim, flickering sporadically like dying stars. Carol's antennae twitched nervously. "It's worse than I remember," she admitted. "The power systems are failing. We'll have to move quickly." David nodded, setting the shuttle to autodock. "What should I expect inside?" "Most of the facility should be dormant," Carl said. "But some of the containment chambers might still be active, if the experiments were left unchecked." David's stomach churned. Let's hope they weren't. They entered the station cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. The air was stale, laced with a faint metallic tang. Broken consoles and shattered glass littered the floor, evidence of a hurried abandonment. Carl led the way, her glowing eyes casting faint light onto the walls. "This way," she whispered, gesturing toward a heavily reinforced door. "The main lab is through here." David examined the door, noting the damaged control panel. "Can you override it?" Carol nodded, extending one of her clawed hands. Her species' natural ability to interface with technology made quick work of the ancient locks. The door groaned open, revealing a large chamber filled with towering tanks of green liquid. Inside the tanks, strange shapes floated, twisted, half-formed creatures that sent a chill down David's spine. "What is this?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Carol's expression darkened. Failed attempts to control the mutation. They tried to create hybrids, beings that could harness the hunger without losing control. None of them survived. David's unease deepened. "Are they alive?" "No," Carl said, "but the data stored here might be. If we can access it, we might find something useful." They approached a central console, its screen flickering with static. Carl interfaced with it, her claws moving swiftly over the controls. Data streams filled the screen, genetic codes, experiment logs, and encrypted files. "Found it," Carl said, her voice steady despite the tension. "There's a protocol here, a way to stabilize the mutation using synthesized human energy. It's risky, but it could work." David frowned. "What's the catch?" Carel hesitated. "The synthesis process requires a direct connection to a living human. The energy drain would be severe. If it fails, it could kill you. David took a deep breath, his resolve unshaken. If it's our best shot, I'm willing to try. Carl's glowing eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and fear. David, you've already risked so much. I can't ask you to do this. You're not asking, David said firmly. I'm offering. Now let's make it happen. Carl nodded, her determination matching his. Together, they prepared the synthesis chamber, knowing the stakes. As David stepped inside, he couldn't help but wonder if this would be the last decision he ever made. But one thing was clear. He trusted Carl. And that trust, he hoped, would be enough to save them both. Redemption and understanding. David felt an icy shiver as the chamber door sealed shut. The hum of the machinery filled the room, blending with the rhythmic pounding of his heart. The synthesis chamber, a relic of desperate Threxian experimentation, loomed around him. Carl worked furiously at the control console outside, her glowing eyes flickering as they scanned the data. Are you ready? Carl asked, her voice strained with fear and urgency. David nodded, his face pale but resolute. Do it. We've come too far to stop now. Carl hesitated, her forearms hovering over the controls. David, if this doesn't work, It will work, David interrupted, his voice steady despite his own doubts. I trust you. Her antennae twitched, and she gave him a small nod before activating the system. The chamber's interior lit up with a soft, green glow as streams of energy began to swirl around David, tugging at the edges of his consciousness. It felt like 1,000 threads were being pulled from his body, leaving him weightless and exposed. Carell monitored the process, her hands darting across the console to stabilize the energy flow. The redouts flickered erratically, and an alarm blared suddenly. Something's wrong, she muttered, her claws gripping the controls tightly. The system's drawing too much from you. I need to recalibrate. No, David's voice crackled through the comms inside the chamber. Don't stop now. Finish it. Carol clenched her jaw, her glowing eyes now bright and determined. She worked faster, manually adjusting the power flow. The swirling energy around David intensified, enveloping him completely. He gasped as his vision blurred, his body trembling under the strain. Finally, with a deafening hum, the process came to an abrupt halt. The energy dissipated, and the chamber doors hissed open. Carol rushed inside, catching David as he collapsed to his knees. David, she cried, her voice filled with panic. He looked up at her, his face pale but alive. Did it work? He asked weakly. Carol nodded, tears streaming down her glowing cheeks. It worked, she whispered. The mutation is stabilizing. The hunger, it's gone. David managed a faint smile. Told you it would. Carol helped him to his feet, her arms supporting him as they left the chamber. Back in the main lab, the console displayed the results. The mutation had been neutralized, the energy synthesis successful. For the first time in weeks, Carol felt normal. The constant gnawing hunger was gone, replaced by a quiet calm she hadn't felt in years. But their relief was short-lived. The station's power systems, already unstable, began to falter. Sparks flew from the walls, and the floor vibrated as an automated voice blared a warning. Structural integrity compromised. Evacuate immediately. Carol's antennae twitched. We need to get out of here. Now. David nodded, leaning on her as they hurried toward the shuttle bay. The station groaned around them, metal plates buckling and collapsing. They'd reached the shuttle just as a massive explosion rocked the facility, sending shockwaves through the asteroid field. Carol piloted the shuttle with expert precision, weaving through the debris as they escaped the doomed station. When they were safely out of range, she turned to David, her glowing eyes filled with gratitude and something deeper, admiration. You risked everything for me, she said softly. Why? David leaned back in his seat, his exhaustion evident. Because you're worth it, Carol. You fought to stay in control, even when everything was pushing you to give in. That kind of strength deserves a second chance. Carol's antennae drooped slightly, a gesture of humility. I wouldn't have made it without you. David smiled faintly. And now we've both got a story no one's going to believe. They shared a quiet laugh, the tension between them finally easing. As the shuttle neared the trade hub, Carol's gaze shifted to the stars beyond the viewport. For the first time, she felt a sense of hope, not just for herself, but for the fragile bond between her kind and humanity. When they docked at the station, David insisted Carl come with him to the authorities. Together, they presented the data from the research station, detailing the cure and the dangers of the mutation. The Galactic Council agreed to implement measures to prevent future outbreaks, and Carol became a central figure in the effort to bridge understanding between species. Weeks later, as David sat in his quarters, recovering from his ordeal, Carol entered with a tray of tea, a human tradition she had adopted in his honor. You should be resting, she chided, placing the tray on the table. I could say the same to you, David replied, grinning. Carol smiled, her glowing eyes now soft and steady. Rest is for those who've finished their work. And we still have much to do. David raised his cup in a toast, to second chances and unlikely friendships. Carol raised her own cup, her antennae twitching in amusement, to the stubborn humans who make them possible. As they sipped their tea, the stars outside seemed a little brighter, a little closer. Together, they had faced the impossible and emerged stronger for it.